I can start with one question for Dr. Broadwell. I was wondering how like machine can understand emotions and expression. Have you ever tested that?
Yeah, I was thinking of how one might, especially with for faces that are making the same expressions. Yeah, it's possible. Actually, I think some of the best work I've seen about this was out of again the Center for Open Digital Humanities in Japan at the Ritsumeikan Art Center. They have this big data set of ukiyo-e face expressions. So they like ran face detection on a whole bunch of them, and then used various emotion detection algorithms to characterize the faces. There's a whole lot of problems with that kind of work. I mean, it's first of all derived from obviously surveillance and just face recognition technology, which certainly has its uses in various projects. But you know, the process of assigning emotions or various descriptions of the faces based on just one snapshot, generally quite low resolution, is problematic. But sometimes it does work, and so that's how the models tend to work. But they're often not culturally specific. I think the group in Japan did try to do some fine tuning to say like, people who are sad are depicted in Japanese art this way, not like you could expect from a naturalistic photographic data set. So that is possible. But is it something I've tried? I just kind of run the standard model. I worked with another project that involves theater work, that live theater. In that case, we tend to just run the out of the box models and see how they do, but we haven't found them all that useful yet.
Follow up if I could, and this is really to all of you. We're now seeing large groups in East Asia building their own AI systems, multimodal, large, not just language models, but cultural models. And that seems potentially like a very positive step forward, especially when, as Pete says, we want to think about cultural appropriation and the way that Asian cultures are represented within the Western context versus within the East Asian context. So my question is, have you been exploring the differences between things like DeepSeek or Qwen? I was pleased to see, Pete, you were running it in Qwen there.
Yes.
And the Western models like Gemini, GPT.
Yeah. I mean, I can start. I would say, first of all, that I know we aren't using the models, but certainly I was thinking just that those juxtapositions of the descriptions of the spaces and the illustrations, certainly, if you were training a cultural model, a lot of people would want to work with that data, whether it's a good idea or not. Eventually, that could be a real goal for some people. And maybe including the 3D models of this. Well, if it's a reconstructed or a real space. Could happen too. But yeah, I think that's a great idea for our work. We haven't done a direct control comparison of the different models. Initially our findings were generally just that, oh, Gemini Flash is terrible at this.
Let's just drop it.
Yeah, let's just use Qwen instead. But they are all getting better, and so I think now that they often can produce passable results no matter what. I think that kind of comparison is definitely warranted.
I have a question for Professor Whiteman. I wonder, like, when you design the XShed project, do you also design maybe the how traffic flow or motion? Because if one experienced the set, as maybe described by these poems, it's usually moving. People are moving in the space, in the garden, or within an architecture, and sometimes it could be quite vague and not certain. So how do you maybe embed this kind of because as you demo, like people are definitely moving, you're able to move around the space, like the route or the motion taken by the viewer? Is it like designed or controlled by whatever information that you glean from the poems, or it's more like a free roaming world that you can experience however you like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the question gets at the sort of how we went about the sort of trying to approach what we saw as the sort of ethics of creating such an environment and then sort of loosing people into it. Essentially the sort of gamification problem. And the answer, we started, originally we started with this idea that we are just going to create a giant environment and you could just move around it. And then we moved away from that really rapidly as we moved towards Jing as the model. In the case of the one that I showed you today, which is the most structured of the three poems spatially, the one that gives the most clear spatial cues, we use and indeed in all of them, basically we use a series of hotspots. And so you move towards that, and while you can deviate a little bit from it, you're guided towards a series of hotspots. And in the case of this one, that's pretty easy because it tells you where you come in. The preface tells you where you come in. To get to the next thing it talks about, which is the stairs, explicitly, you have to follow a pretty particular path. We don't allow you to walk across the grass, for instance. You have to walk along the lawn. You have to go down the stairs, but then you can come back up the stairs, because actually, although we take you downstairs to see the fact that there are 2 floors, the poem indicates that the probable sort of ideal viewing point is actually on the upper level, on a desk that you didn't see on the upper level. And so then you can come back up to that. And so the answer basically is that we also, in another version, there is another one of the 3 that we're doing. The poem is set to music, and a different piece of, or it was designed to be music. And so it was designed to be such music. And so in another piece of research, one of the researchers on the team recovered and reconstructed the piece of music from Qing archives, from Qing sheet music. And so we have a recording that is, I suppose, theoretically, the first time it's been heard in 200 or 300 years. It's quite a super cool thing. But in any case, you trigger that performance by getting to a certain hotspot. And that is for certain a form of gamification, I suppose. There's a goal to that, which is, but the premise for that was that like all of them, there were the ideal, the intended experience was, for instance, in that case, to hear the piece of music while gazing onto the water from a particular point within the architecture. And so the idea was to get you to go there so that you could have this ideal experience. Similarly, another one, you are supposed to see the flowers that are the subject of it from a particular spot. And so the answer, ultimately the answer to all of that is no, you cannot wander randomly around the garden. It's a little bit like should I just lost the name of that? The Truman Show, which is probably so you don't see, but like there are obvious spots in the model where it just ends. Like there isn't stuff. And so we are trying to keep you away from that stuff so that we don't have to build indefinitely. We've had a real problem with model weight and keeping the whole thing working. And so we had to sort of cause the world to end pretty fast. So there are both practical and sort of ethical considerations there.
Well, this is a follow-up on Jeff's question about comparing different AI models from the West and the East. So how do you feel this is going to impact the scholarship? Do you foresee that, because there could be silo, right? Like, okay, you cannot use AI from certain countries. Do you foresee there will be a future with disconnect of scholarship, where people are able to use all the AI models, and then those different like a cultural and other elements are going to inspire people to come up with new different research questions and different methodologies? So how do you see that in the future?
I could I can start. I mean, well, yeah, I guess politically there are some concerns. You know, it's that seems to be the main. Well, okay, there are political and commercial concerns. There's certainly we thought it was good enough to say if a model is at least open weights, you know, it's released on Hugging Face or whatever, then you can run it. Then that generally, if it's possible to do that, if the model is, you know, can be made small enough to be shared and run locally, then that should be okay. Except now you get various misguided government agencies saying, well, if the model is from China at all, you just can't run it. You know, and if you do it, you're in danger of losing your funding. And there's not much we can say to that because it's a nonsensical argument. That's just an entirely political decision. But there are still concerns about other when the issue we have the situation we have in the US now, where the most powerful models are the frontier models that are always hidden behind an API at Google or OpenAI. I think that will be that for now is the main cause of siloing and limiting access to the technology. And but I think they're encouraging signs that approach is probably not going to last very long. Eventually it'll get easier to run the model more sophisticated models locally if you need to. At least for images and text, there's always a constantly moving frontier of well, to do stuff with video, then you really need a big model and lots of compute you may not have, and you still have to rely on the big corporations to do that. But generally, I think it's done well. The diversification of these models to be tuned to particular eras and cultural cultural settings is great, and I think there is an infrastructure that's available for scholars, even if they were like fine tuning their own models. There are ways of sharing that. It's like sharing 3D models. You know, it's a little difficult, that you can do it. So I think there's a lot of potential there. And the barriers are somewhat disciplinary, somewhat political, and somewhat commercial, rather than any limitations on scholarly imagination. But that's my opinion. Maybe.
Yeah, I feel that so one of the points I want to raise about the most recent development of LLM is I think the speed of AI development is really what it is something we should take into consideration, because a lot of the times when if an older model cannot recognize some of these cultural nuances, actually some of the most recent ones do. And I do see there is indeed a trend, like China and US are building more diverse LLM models, but even like within Southeast Asia, I think, for example, like AI Singapore are actively building their own, they call it Sea Lion model, and it was initially started as a textual model, but now it has evolved into its V4 version, which is a multi-model ones, and they are seeking. And a lot of the like these large language models coming from like a region like Southeast Asia, which is famous for its cultural diversity. Their selling point are exactly the cultural brand and their cultural sensitivity. So I do think that but we will also have to know that a lot of these models are trained using some existing models, such as like Q1, and like I think Sea Lion was trained based on both Q1 and Gemma, which was developed by Google DeepMind. So how well can this fine-tuning of these existing base models is still in question. But indeed, I think the one of the main important reason that these regions training their own models are for these cultural sensitivities. I just don't know how well it can perform. We will have to like do more experiments and try. So I actually have a question for Professor Broadwell, and wanted to ask whether you have tried all these experiments with maybe GPT 4.0 vision model, because I think I've used this to generate some of the descriptions for like a Singapore historical photos, and it is very surprisingly accurate. It can even find out the exact road that the photographs was taken. And I didn't actually feed any metadata at the time. So I maybe I suspect because a lot of the photographs, the smaller the low resolution version actually released online in National Archives of Singapore. So it's possible that GPT has scraped all these data and they use that to train their multimodal ones. So that's why they can recognize exactly which road that was. But still, it's a historical photo. So I was quite shocked that they can detect that one. And I have another question for Professor Whiteman as well, but maybe I wanted to hear what's Professor Broadwell say about this.
Oh, sure, thanks. Yeah, just briefly, in our initial, at least for the captioning work, our initial experiments did find that the frontier models, that especially the GPT models, vision models, tended to be the best. And a lot of our results though are focused on using what we could run locally instead. With justification being how it scales better, you don't have to pay as much for processing tokens, although it can be still pretty cheap to use the frontier model, the closed models. But also there are concerns about sending our images and materials to OpenAI, even though our Stanford has a subscription to the Microsoft Azure portal into OpenAI, which theoretically doesn't allow your data to be used for training. Theoretically, yes.
Legally, they can't do it, but they do it anyway.
They do it anyway. Anyway, but yeah, that is definitely a big a noticeable dynamic though, is that the newer models, the GPT vision models, are really good at that. And so to some degree, yeah, it's impressive to see that, but then if you use those, you also lose some of the more interesting examples of places where the models are obviously getting things wrong in interesting ways. But yeah, for actual use in production, to have captions that we don't want to be embarrassed by, there's a strong argument that you should do whatever it is. That's what we're trying to figure out these days. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. I have another question for Professor Whiteman. So as I mentioned, I was very curious about your idea for the plausible fiction, especially for these non-perspectival paintings. So because my question is, because I was thinking if we want to do some reconstruction, transforming like a 2D version painting into like a 3D ones, it's inevitable that we use some camera logic to read it. So I was just curious, how do you like draw the line between this decentralized these Western tools that we often use for the reconstruction?
Yeah, so thanks. That's an interesting question. In the case of plausible fictions, what that was really, that's an expression that we've used in connection to the virtual mountain estate, and it is around trying to fill in spaces of knowledge or information that we don't have, gaps in our knowledge, with things that plausibly represent something that a plausible fiction. It's not the interior furnishings are not accurate because we don't have a document that says what they were. And we don't know what specific objects they are, but we come up with something that is plausibly Qing based on Qing archives and from a later period, and that they sort of fill in that space. And I guess what I would say is that in the case of the virtual mountain estate, that's driven very clearly by what the research question is. The research question is not an architectural history question. It's not how are these buildings furnished. It's not how tall was the building, though we have a reasonably good idea, and we obviously the models themselves sort of again are based on reasoned inference from knowledge, from information that we do have. The research question is around experience and the relationship between interactive and immersive media and the sort of modeling of experience and the testing of experience. And so the question of the architecture or the furnishing is, what do we need to do to create a movie set that is plausible, that supports the exploration of our primary research question, which is about subjective embodied experience in this particular cultural context. I say that because one of the, I mean, not knowing, this is not a comment on the modeling that you're doing about painting, the transition from 2D to 3D models of paintings. But I generally think that those, based on the experiences that I have seen, the examples that I have seen, I think that they're problematic because I don't understand what the art historical question is that they're asking. If what they're trying to do is create a visitor experience that gives you some sense of the spatiality or the sort of ways in which paintings were read, then I think that they've got value within some pretty carefully circumscribed boundaries. But as actual art historical methods, I don't know precisely what they're doing unless you can determine, unless what they are doing is trying to model the representational technologies that the painter was employing. To do that, you need to understand what those representational technologies are. Now, if you're working in Renaissance painting, you know what those technologies are, right? There are a series of mathematical processes that are based on an understanding, a misinformed understanding, but nevertheless an understanding of how the eye works. And how vision worked, and they're trying to do that, and they become more and more sophisticated over the course of a number of centuries. And then, as several people as many people have, at least several people have already done, you can build models, and then the gaps between the model and the painting, you see the ways in which they both used and departed from perspectival rules. That was what we were trying to do with Lungmei as well, which was to say, we were sort of operating on trying, or that's not what we were trying to do. What we were trying to do in Lungmei was essentially flip that around. We were trying to say, normally you know the rules, what process does it get you? Or what result does it get you? Here, what we were saying was, we know what result we have the Lungmei. Can we essentially reverse engineer that to try to understand how it was done? And the answer was, within some sort of carefully constructed answers, yes, we can. But that was always my assumption. And that's why when I first took it to a lab in Australia that I shall not name because I was not impressed with the response. What they did was they were like, look, what we'll do, one of the basic problems was how do you look at that valley floor and project it onto the earth? Can you take Lungmei's valley floor and project it on the earth? Can you essentially georeference that painting? And the first, because to figure out whether there's any sort of relationship to mathematical surveying, you have to do something that looks like georeferencing that painting. And the first example that was given me was someone who did something like the BM. He chopped it into slices and he went, look, and he laid it out on a horizontal plane. And I said, yeah, but how does that relate to the painting? He was like, well, look, there are these, stages. And I said, well, but that doesn't tell me anything about how the painter did it. And so I guess, I don't know if that answers the question exactly. To me, that's the real, in the painting analysis, that's what I'm trying to do, is see what I can understand about certain encounters in the early modern in terms of pictorial technology. The last thing I'll say, because I've gone too long, is just go back to the question that was asked previously about siloing of knowledge and siloing of models. From an art historical perspective, And Julian, I loved your presentation. I think it's like, I was really excited at the way you were sort of creating these image networks and these sort of image economy. But from an art historical perspective, most of the tools that I'm seeing, I'm not just talking about AI tools, I'm talking about digital technology, digital projects in general, are very project specific. Right, they like, lots of people ask me when I present Lung May, well, can I use it, can I use that on my painting? I'm like, don't know, you can use the idea, you can use the method, you can use the approach, but is the answer the same? Does it actually tell you about any other Chinese painting? That I really don't know. And I say that because I still think we're at a phase where much of what, and probably we may always be at a phase where much of what we're doing is specific to the project that we are constructing. If you figure out what Ma can do, first of all, you've got to figure out what Ma is already, so you can teach something what it is, by which time you already have the answer to your question at some level. But then the moment you try to do it for another concept, you need to redefine it again, and maybe your tool changes because your concept has changed. And I think that is important to remember. That's not a flaw. That's a virtue.
Yeah.
It's remembering that the things we're doing are trying to answer specific questions. And when we start to imagine that they can answer all questions, is when we slip from a sort of Eurocentric problem to a Sinocentric problem or whatever problem. I mean, we replicate our blind spot.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really great place for us to certainly continue the conversation as we head into lunch, and then also during